March 17, 1945. Western Germany, somewhere between the Rhine and the Ruhr. Sergeant Thomas Carver sat in the commander's cupola of his M4 Sherman tank, watching smoke rise from what remained of Oberkirchen, a town that had existed for 800 years until 3 days ago. He was 24 years old. His crew had been together for 7 months, since Normandy. They had seen 41 days of combat. They had learned not to look too closely at the things they passed. The Sherman was designated C-27, Charlie Company, 2nd Battalion, 3rd Armored Division. It carried a 75mm main gun, 3.30 caliber machine guns, and a crew of 5 men who had stopped counting the villages they'd helped destroy. The tank weighed 33 tons. It moved through rubble the way a plow moves through frozen earth, slowly, grinding everything beneath its tracks into smaller pieces. Carver's crew consisted of 4 other men. Private First Class Eddie Reese drove. He was 19, from Kansas, could thread the Sherman through spaces that looked impossible. Corporal James Mitchell operated the bow machine gun and assisted with navigation. He was 22, quiet, read every letter from home at least 3 times. Corporal Robert Hayes loaded and fired the main gun. He was 26, fastest loader in the company, could get off 12 rounds per minute if needed. Private Leon Foster operated the radio and the coaxial machine gun mounted beside the 75mm. He was 20, from Louisiana, hummed gospel songs when he was nervous. They had been ordered to clear the road through Oberkirchen. Clear meant make passable for supply trucks. It meant push debris aside. It meant identify any German positions that might still be active. It meant drive through the center of town at 5 miles per hour while looking for signs of resistance. The town had been bombed 2 days earlier. First by British Lancasters at night, then by American B-17s in the morning. The bombing was supposed to destroy a German ammunition depot located somewhere in the town center. Intelligence reports indicated heavy anti-aircraft positions and possibly a reinforced infantry company. The reports were mostly correct. The depot had been there. The anti-aircraft guns had been there. The infantry had been there. Now there was rubble. Stone buildings built in the 1600s collapsed into stone buildings built in the 1700s. Brick homes from the 1800s buried brick homes from the 1900s. Church spires toppled into market squares. School walls fell into residential streets. Everything that had stood vertical now lay horizontal. The air smelled like pulverized mortar, shattered tile, and burning wood. It was the smell that came after bombs turned architecture into geology. The Sherman moved forward at 3 miles per hour. Reese kept the throttle low. The engine rumbled. Tracks clanked over broken cobblestones and compressed debris. The tank was loud. Always loud. The engine produced 400 horsepower and enough noise to drown out conversation unless you used the intercom system. Carver scanned the ruins through his binoculars. Left to right, then right to left. Looking for movement. Looking for muzzle flashes. Looking for anything that indicated someone was still alive and armed in the wreckage. He saw nothing that moved. Just gray stone and red brick and black smoke. The town was dead. That was clear. They had been doing this for 7 months. Normandy in June. The breakout through France in July and August. The liberation of Paris. The push into Belgium. The Battle of the Bulge in December, when German tanks nearly cut the Allied advance in half and killed more Americans than any single battle since the Civil War. Then across the Rhine 2 weeks ago. Now Germany itself. Each village looked the same after bombing. Each town produced the same smell. Each city left the same taste in your mouth, dust and ash and something else you couldn't name but recognized immediately. Death had a taste. Everyone who served in a tank crew learned this. You couldn't avoid it. The tank wasn't sealed. Air came in through vents and hatches and the gaps around the gun mount. Whatever was in the air outside came inside. Carver had stopped being surprised by what bombs did to places. In Normandy, he'd been shocked by the destruction. By August, he expected it. By December, he barely noticed. Now, in March, he felt nothing when he looked at destroyed towns. This was normal. This was what war looked like in 1945. You flattened everything, then you drove through it, then you moved to the next place and did it again. The radio crackled. Company commander calling for situation reports. Carver reported clear so far. No contacts. No resistance. Charlie 27 proceeding through objective as ordered. The commander acknowledged and told him to continue. Battalion wanted the road open by 1600 hours. Supply convoy needed to get through tonight. They continued forward. The Sherman pushed aside a collapsed wall that blocked the street. Stone scraped against the front armor with a sound like tearing metal. The wall gave way. They drove over it. Tracks crushed stone into gravel. Behind them, the road was technically passable now. A truck could get through if the driver was careful. Reese navigated around a crater in the center of the street. Direct hit from a 500-pound bomb. The crater was 15 feet across and 8 feet deep. Its edges were perfectly round. The street around it looked like someone had peeled back the earth to show what lay underneath, layers of cobblestone, then dirt, then older cobblestone from when the street was rebuilt after the last war, then more dirt, then medieval stonework from before anyone kept proper records. Mitchell called out a potential sniper position, a half-collapsed building with intact upper floors overlooking the street. Carver traversed the turret right and aimed the coaxial machine gun at the windows. Nothing. No movement. Probably empty. But they watched it anyway until the tank moved past and the building was behind them. You couldn't be certain. German soldiers sometimes hid in ruins and waited until American tanks passed, then fired at the softer rear armor or the exposed supply trucks that followed. The crew had been in combat long enough to develop routines. Reese watched the ground immediately in front for obstacles. Mitchell watched the left side. Hayes operated the main gun and watched right. Foster monitored radio traffic and watched forward. Carver watched everything and made decisions. This was how you survived in a Sherman. Division of responsibility. Constant vigilance. Trust in your crew. They trusted each other completely. In 7 months of combat, they had learned each other's voices, each other's habits, each other's fears. They knew who cracked jokes under pressure and who went silent. They knew who needed conversation during long movements and who preferred quiet. They knew these things the way brothers know each other. The war had taught them to compartmentalize. You couldn't think about the people who lived in these buildings before the bombs came. You couldn't wonder where they went. You couldn't imagine families sitting at tables in rooms that were now open to the sky. You couldn't picture children playing in streets that were now buried under 10 feet of brick. If you thought about those things, you couldn't do your job. So you didn't think about them. This was the problem in March 1945. Not just for Carver's crew, but for every American soldier advancing through Germany. They were liberating a country by destroying it. They were ending a war by turning cities into moonscapes. They were saving Europe by burning Germany to ash. The moral complexity of this situation was never discussed. No one talked about it. No one questioned it. The Germans had started this war. The Germans had bombed London and Warsaw and Rotterdam. The Germans had built death camps and systematic murder into national policy. Therefore, Germany deserved this. The logic was simple and absolute. It had to be simple. You couldn't fight a war while debating philosophy. You couldn't advance through Germany while questioning whether civilians deserved to have their homes obliterated. The orders came down from Division. Division received them from Corps. Corps received them from Army. Army received them from SHAF. SHAF received them from Washington and London. No one questioned the chain. Everyone followed orders. But the problem wasn't really about orders. The problem was deeper. The problem was what happened to men who spent months driving tanks through the rubble of someone else's civilization. What happened to their capacity for mercy? What happened to their ability to see suffering and respond to it? What happened when you trained yourself not to look, not to think, not to feel, because feeling meant you couldn't function? The Sherman moved deeper into Oberkirchen. The rubble got thicker. Buildings hadn't just collapsed, they'd been pulverized. Strategic bombing in 1945 used high-explosive bombs heavy enough to penetrate deep into structures before detonating. The explosions created pressure waves that didn't just knock buildings down, they atomized them. Stone turned to dust. Brick became powder. Wood became splinters fine as hair. Carver checked his watch. 1,434 hours. They'd been clearing the road for 90 minutes. Maybe another hour of work ahead. Then they could return to the company assembly area, refuel, rearm, sleep for a few hours before the next mission. This was the rhythm of mechanized warfare in Germany. Move, fight, rest. Move, fight, rest. Day after day. Week after week. No one on the crew said much. There was nothing to say. This was routine. Just another destroyed town. Just another road to clear. Just another day in March 1945. They were trained not to care. That was the real problem. The army had trained them exceptionally well. The sound came at 1,447 hours. Reese slowed the tank to navigate around a collapsed building that blocked most of the street. The engine note changed. The constant roar dropped to a lower pitch. In that moment of relative quiet, Foster heard something else. He said, "Wait." Carver said, "What?" Foster said, "Stop. Stop the tank." Reese applied the brakes. The Sherman came to a halt. Track settled. The engine idled. Still loud, but not overwhelming. In the reduced noise, they all heard it. A child. Crying. The sound was faint. Muffled. Coming from somewhere nearby but impossible to locate precisely. It rose and fell. Sometimes louder, sometimes barely audible. But it was definitely a child. Maybe 3 years old. Maybe younger. Impossible to tell. Hayes said, "Jesus Christ." Mitchell said, "Where is it coming from?" Carver stood up in the commander's cupola and listened. The crying continued. He tried to pinpoint the direction. East? South? The ruins created echoes that distorted everything. Sound bounced off broken walls and traveled down empty spaces where streets used to be. The source could be 30 feet away or 200 feet away. Foster said, "Somewhere to our right." Maybe. Carver said, "Everyone shut up and listen." They went silent. Only the idling engine and the distant crying. The sound was definitely coming from the right side of the street. Somewhere in the massive pile of rubble that used to be residential buildings. The crying came in waves. The child would cry for 10 or 15 seconds, then stop for a few seconds, then start again. Carver made a decision. He said, "Foster, radio company. Tell them Charlie 27 has stopped to investigate possible civilian casualty." Reese, shut down the engine. Reese said, "Shut it down." "Sir, if we need to move fast." Carver said, "We can't hear anything with the engine running." "Shut it down." Reese complied. The engine coughed twice and went silent. The sudden absence of mechanical noise was almost shocking. They'd been living inside the sound of the Sherman for so long that silence felt unnatural. Now they could hear everything. Wind moving through broken buildings. Distant artillery fire from somewhere north. Birds. Somehow there were still birds. And the crying. Much clearer now. Definitely a child. Definitely coming from the rubble pile to their right. Maybe 50 feet away. Hayes said, "Could be a trap." Mitchell said, "Germans used children as bait before." Carver knew this was true. Intelligence reports described incidents where German soldiers placed wounded civilians in exposed positions, then waited for American medics or infantry to approach before opening fire. It had happened in France. It had happened in Belgium. It could happen here. But this didn't sound like a trap. The crying was too desperate. Too genuine. Too broken. Foster said, "If it's a trap, they would have shot at us already. We've been stopped for 2 minutes." Carver said, "I'm going to look." Mitchell, Hayes, cover me. Foster, stay on the radio. Reese, be ready to restart the engine if we need to move fast. He climbed out of the commander's cupola and dropped to the ground beside the tank. Mitchell and Hayes opened their hatches and positioned themselves with weapons ready. Mitchell had his Thompson submachine gun. Hayes had his M1 carbine. They scanned the ruins for any sign of German soldiers. Carver walked toward the rubble pile. His boots crunched on pulverized brick. The crying got louder. The child was definitely in there somewhere. Buried. Trapped. Alive. He reached the edge of the rubble pile and stopped. The destruction was incomprehensible up close. This had been a 3-story apartment building. Maybe 4 apartments per floor. Maybe 50 or 60 people living here. Now it was just a mound of broken material 20 feet high and 40 feet wide. Everything that had been vertical was now horizontal and mixed together. Walls, floors, ceilings, furniture, belongings, all crushed into an unsorted mass. The crying came from inside this mass. Somewhere near the center. Maybe 10 or 15 feet deep. Carver called out in German. He'd learned basic phrases. Useful for accepting surrenders and interrogating prisoners. He said, "Wo bist du? Where are you?" The crying stopped. Silence for 3 seconds. Then a small voice. Also in German. A girl. She said, "Hilf. Help." Carver said, "We're helfen da. We will help you." The girl started crying again. This time it sounded different. Not just fear. Relief mixed with fear. Someone had hurt her. Someone was there. Mitchell called from the tank, "Sir, we need to keep moving. Battalion wants the road clear by 1600. Carver looked back at the tank, then at the rubble pile. Orders were orders. The road needed to be cleared. The supply convoy needed to get through. The war didn't stop because one child was trapped in one building in one destroyed town. But the crying didn't stop either. Carver said, "Get down here. All of you. We're going to dig her out." Foster said, "Sir, we have orders." Carver said, "Get down here. Now." They came. Reese left the driver's position. Foster left the radio. Hayes and Mitchell climbed out of their hatches. 4 men stood beside their tank commander looking at a pile of rubble that contained a child. Hayes said, "This could take hours." "We don't have hours." Carver said, "Then we work fast. Start moving stone." They started. No tools except their hands and whatever they could improvise. Reese found a piece of steel beam and used it as a lever to shift larger stones. Mitchell and Hayes lifted chunks of concrete and carried them away from the pile. Foster and Carver worked at the point where the crying seemed loudest, carefully removing smaller debris piece by piece. The work was slow. Each stone they moved revealed more stones underneath. The building had collapsed in layers. You couldn't just dig straight down. You had to understand the structure. You had to identify which pieces were supporting weight and which pieces could be safely removed. If you pulled the wrong stone, the entire pile could shift and crush whoever was trapped beneath it. The girl cried steadily now. They called to her every few minutes to let her know they were still there. She responded in German. Simple words. Bit. Please. Hilf. Help. Mama. Mother. Foster said, "Her mother might be in there too." Carver said, "Keep digging." After 20 minutes, they'd created a gap in the rubble about 3 feet deep. They could see wooden beams from the ceiling mixed with plaster and brick. Below that, darkness. The girl was down there somewhere. They were getting closer. The radio in the tank crackled. Company commander calling for status. Foster ran back to answer. He returned 30 seconds later and said, "Battalion is asking why we've stopped. Company wants us to continue the mission." Carver said, "Tell them we encountered a delayed action bomb. Tell them we're evaluating whether the road is safe." Foster said, "That's lying, sir." Carver said, "That's an order. Tell them we'll resume in 30 minutes. Foster went back to the tank. Hayes and Mitchell shared a look but said nothing. They kept digging. At the 40-minute mark, they reached wood. Part of a door or maybe a table. It was wedged at an angle, creating a small space beneath it. The crying was coming from that space. Clear now. Very close. Carver lay flat on his stomach and looked into the gap. He could see movement in the darkness. Small. Maybe 2 feet down. He said in German, "Can you hear me?" The girl said, "Ja." "Yes." He said, "We're going to get you out. Don't move. Stay where you are. He stood up and assessed the situation. The wooden piece was supporting maybe 500 pounds of debris above it. If they removed the wood, everything would collapse into the space where the girl was trapped. They needed to shore it up first. Create a stable opening. Reese said, we could use the tow cable from the tank. Loop it under that beam there, attach it to something solid, create tension to hold the weight. Mitchell said, that might work. They rigged the system. It took 15 minutes. The tow cable ran from the Sherman's front towing hooks, under a major support beam in the rubble pile, then tied off to a piece of steel reinforcement they dug out from deeper in the pile. Carver tested it by pulling on the beam. It held. The weight was distributed. They could now safely remove debris from around the wooden piece. The radio crackled again. This time the company commander's voice was insistent. Battalion was ordering them to continue immediately. The convoy was already delayed. Carver needed to complete the mission now or face disciplinary action. Carver ignored the radio. They kept working. Hayes and Mitchell removed stone from around the wooden piece. The gap widened. After another 10 minutes, they could see into the space below. A small cavity maybe 3 feet wide and 18 inches high. And in that cavity, a girl. She was maybe 4 years old. Blonde hair matted with dust. Face streaked with tears and dirt. Wearing what used to be a blue dress. She was curled in a fetal position, wedged between fallen timbers. Physically she appeared uninjured. No blood visible. No obvious broken bones. But her eyes were wide with terror. Carver reached down into the gap. He said in German, "Give me your hand." She didn't move. She was too frightened. He said, "It's safe now. You can come out." Foster knelt beside Carver and started humming one of his gospel songs. Something soft. Something a child might recognize as comforting even if she didn't understand the words. The melody was simple and gentle. The girl stopped crying. She listened to the humming. Then slowly, very slowly, she reached up with one small hand. Carver took her hand and pulled gently. She came up through the gap. Mitchell helped guide her shoulders through. In 5 seconds, she was out. Free. Alive. Carver set her on solid ground beside the rubble pile. She stood there looking at 5 American soldiers, none of whom spoke German well enough to explain what had happened or what would happen next. Foster kept humming. The girl didn't cry. She just stood there, trembling. Mitchell said, "What do we do with her now?" That was the question. They'd saved her life. But saving her life meant they were now responsible for her. They couldn't leave her alone in the ruins. They couldn't take her with them in the tank. They were combat soldiers, not civilians prepared to care for a traumatized child. Carver said, "There must be a displaced persons collection point somewhere. Or military government detachment. We'll find someone who can take care of her." Hayes said, "Sir, we're already an hour behind schedule. Battalion is going to have our heads for this." Carver looked at the girl. She was watching him. Still silent. Still trembling. 4 years old and completely alone in a destroyed world she couldn't possibly understand. He said, "I don't care." That was the transformation. Not a dramatic moment. Not a grand gesture. Just 4 words. I don't care. 7 months of conditioning reversed in one moment because a child was crying and 5 men decided that orders didn't matter as much as doing what was obviously right. They put the girl in the tank. There was no other choice. They couldn't leave her in the ruins. They couldn't carry her while clearing the road. The only option was to bring her with them until they found someone who could take responsibility for her care. Foster climbed back into his radio operator position. Mitchell and Hayes returned to their stations. Reese restarted the engine. Carver lifted the girl up to the commander's cupola and set her on the seat beside him. She weighed maybe 40 pounds. She didn't speak. She just sat there holding onto the edge of the hatch with both hands while the Sherman's engine rumbled beneath her. The radio was chaos. Battalion had been calling every 5 minutes. Company commander was furious. Where was Charlie, 27? Why weren't they responding? The convoy was delayed. Division was asking questions. Heads were going to roll. Carver picked up the handset and reported. Said they'd encountered unexpected obstacles. Said they were resuming the mission now. Said they'd make up time. The company commander told him to report to the battalion commander immediately after completing the road clearance. There would be consequences for this delay. Carver acknowledged and put down the handset. Beside him, the girl watched everything with wide eyes. She'd stopped crying completely. She seemed more curious than frightened now. She'd been buried alone in darkness, and now she was sitting on top of a 33-ton tank surrounded by American soldiers. The transition was so extreme that her mind couldn't fully process it. She existed in a state of shock that manifested as eerie calm. They continued through Oberkirchen. The work went faster now. Reese pushed aside debris with renewed efficiency. They cleared another half-mile of road in 45 minutes. By 16:45 hours, they reached the eastern edge of town and reported the road passable. Mission complete. Technically. The convoy would arrive in 2 hours. That gave them time to deal with the girl. Carver told Reese to head north toward the battalion rear area where medical and support elements were located. There would be nurses there. Chaplains. People better equipped to handle traumatized children than tank crews. They drove for 20 minutes through relatively undamaged countryside. The girl sat motionless beside Carver. He tried to talk to her in broken German. Asked her name. She didn't respond. Asked if she was hurt. She didn't respond. Asked if she was hungry. She nodded. That was the first communication. A nod. Something. Foster passed up a K ration from his supply. The girl ate slowly. Chocolate bar first, then crackers. She chewed carefully, like she was trying to remember how eating worked. Carver watched her and felt something he hadn't felt in months. Actual concern for another human being who wasn't part of his crew. In 7 months of combat, he'd become numb. That was necessary. You couldn't care about every civilian you saw. You couldn't mourn every destroyed home. You couldn't weep for every refugee column. If you tried to feel everything, you'd break. So you felt nothing. That was the consequence of mechanized warfare in 1945. Soldiers became machines operating machines, and machines didn't have feelings. But now, watching a 4-year-old girl eat chocolate from a K ration while sitting on a tank, Carver felt the machinery crack. He felt human again. He felt responsible. Not for the war. Not for the bombing. Not for the strategic decisions made by generals and politicians. But for this one specific child who was alive because he'd decided to stop and listen. That was significant. He'd made a choice. Not following orders made you think differently. It created a crack in the structure of military discipline that defined everything about how the army functioned. You were supposed to follow orders. Always. The entire system depended on instant obedience. If every soldier made individual moral decisions about which orders to follow and which to ignore, the army couldn't function. But sometimes the orders were wrong. Or not wrong exactly, but insufficient. Clearing the road was important. The supply convoy was important. Maintaining the advance was important. But none of that was more important than a child's life. Carver understood this instinctively. His crew understood it too. They'd all stopped to dig without being ordered. They'd all chosen humanity over efficiency. They reached the battalion rear area at 1715 hours. Medical tents, supply trucks, communications equipment. Dozens of soldiers performing support functions. Carver climbed out of the tank with the girl in his arms and looked for someone in charge. A captain from the medical company saw him and walked over. She was maybe 30 years old, looked exhausted, had the insignia of an army nurse on her collar. She said, "What happened here?" Carver explained. Found the girl in Oberkirchen. Dug her out of rubble. Brought her here. Needs care. The nurse took the girl gently and examined her. Checked for injuries, asked questions in German. The girl responded to the nurse but still didn't speak much. The nurse said, "She's in shock. Probably dehydrated. Possibly injured internally, we'll need to examine her properly. You did the right thing bringing her here." Carver said, what happens to her now? The nurse said, military government will place her in a displaced persons camp. Eventually they'll try to locate surviving family members. If there are none, she'll be sent to an orphanage in Belgium or France until more permanent arrangements can be made. Carver asked, what are her chances of finding family? The nurse looked at him directly. She said, in Oberkirchen. After what happened there? She didn't need to finish the sentence. The girl's chances of finding surviving family members were close to zero. Carver nodded. He understood. He started to walk back to his tank, then stopped and turned around. He said, her name. I never asked her name. The nurse was already carrying the girl toward the medical tent. She called back, I'll find out. Carver returned to Charlie, 27. His crew was refueling and performing maintenance. They worked in silence. Hayes replaced damaged track links. Mitchell cleaned the machine guns. Foster checked the radio. Reese inspected the engine oil levels. Normal post-mission procedures. But the atmosphere was different. Something had changed. Mitchell finally said, are we in trouble? For stopping? Carver said, probably. Battalion wants to see me. Hayes said, worth it though. Right? No one answered immediately. Then Reese said, yeah. Worth it. The battalion commander summoned Carver at 1800 hours. Lieutenant Colonel Harrison commanded 2nd Battalion. He was 38 years old, West Point graduate, combat veteran from North Africa and Sicily. He ran the battalion by the book. No tolerance for deviation from orders. No excuses for delays. Carver stood at attention in the command tent. Harrison read the after-action report about Charlie 27's delayed clearance of Oberkirchen. He didn't look up while reading. When he finished, he set the report down and said, Sergeant, do you understand why your delay created problems for this battalion? Carver said, yes, sir. Harrison said, the supply convoy was delayed 90 minutes. That convoy contained ammunition needed by units in contact with German forces. Those units had to ration ammunition for 90 minutes because of your decision. Carver said, yes, sir. Harrison said, tell me why you stopped. Carver explained. The crying. The girl. The decision to dig her out. Harrison listened without interrupting. When Carver finished, Harrison was quiet for maybe 30 seconds. Then he said, how old is your daughter, Sergeant? Carver was surprised by the question. He said, 3, sir. I have a daughter who's 3. Harrison said, I have a son who's 5. In Ohio. Haven't seen him in 18 months. He paused, then said, you're confined to quarters for 72 hours effective immediately. No missions. No duties. Consider it punishment for delaying the convoy. Another pause. Unofficially, I'm glad you found that girl. Sometimes we forget what we're actually fighting for. Carver was dismissed. He walked back to his tent understanding that he'd received both a punishment and a commendation in the same conversation. The punishment was official. Would go in his record. Would affect his promotion prospects. The commendation was private. Would never be written down. Would exist only in Harrison's mind and in the minds of the 5 men who'd stopped to listen. The crew didn't run any missions for 3 days. Other tanks from Charlie Company completed the assignments. Carver's crew performed maintenance, wrote letters, slept. They didn't talk much about Oberkirchen or the girl. There was nothing to say. They'd done what they'd done. The consequences were what they were. On the 3rd day, the nurse from the medical company found Carver. She said, I thought you might want to know. The girl's name is Anna. Anna Hoffmann. We located an aunt in a refugee camp near Aachen. The aunt survived. She's been searching for the child since the bombing. Military government is arranging transport. Anna will be with her aunt by the end of the week. Carver said, she's going to be okay. The nurse said, physically, yes. Emotionally. She shrugged. She watched her family die. She was buried alive for 36 hours before you found her. That kind of trauma doesn't heal quickly. But she'll have family. That matters. After the nurse left, Carver told his crew. They received the news quietly. Foster said, "Good. That's good." That was all. They went back to their maintenance work. But something had fundamentally changed in how they approached their duties. They still followed orders. They still completed missions. But they also looked. They paid attention. They remembered that beneath the rubble were human beings who deserved to be treated like human beings. Charlie, 27, returned to combat operations on March 21. They participated in the encirclement of the Ruhr pocket. They advanced across central Germany through April. They reached Czechoslovakia in early May. They survived the war. All 5 crew members came home alive. This was statistically unlikely. Of the Sherman tanks that landed in Normandy, 70% were knocked out of action at least once. Crew survival rates varied, but casualties were heavy. Carver's crew credited their survival to luck and preparation and trust. But there was something else. After Oberkirchen, they fought differently. They were more careful. More thoughtful. They valued their own lives more because they'd remembered that life had value beyond military objectives. The war ended on May 8, 1945. Germany surrendered. Charlie, 27, was in Bavaria when the announcement came. The crew celebrated quietly. Then they started the process of returning to civilian life. Before shipping home, Carver wrote to the medical company nurse. Asked if she had any information about Anna Hoffmann. The nurse replied 3 weeks later. Anna was with her aunt. They were living in a temporary housing facility in Aachen. Conditions were difficult but stable. The aunt was working with refugee services to emigrate to the United States if possible. Carver kept that letter. He kept it through his demobilization and his return to Virginia and his reunion with his wife and daughter. He kept it for the rest of his life. In the letter, the nurse had included one additional detail. Anna had started talking again. She'd told her aunt about the American soldiers who dug her out of the rubble. She'd said they sang to her. That detail was important to Carver. It meant she remembered them not as the people who destroyed her town, but as the people who saved her life. That distinction mattered. The same soldiers who participated in the bombing of Germany also saved a German child. This wasn't contradiction. This was complexity. War created situations where you could both destroy and save, both kill and rescue, both follow orders and choose humanity. The war made men into machines. But sometimes, briefly, the machines remembered they were men. In 1964, Thomas Carver received a letter from West Germany. He was 43 years old by then. Living in Richmond, Virginia. Working as a high school history teacher. Married to his wartime sweetheart. 3 children, 2 daughters and a son. He'd thought about the war less and less over the years. Not because he'd forgotten, but because civilian life demanded different kinds of attention. Bills needed paying. Children needed raising. Lesson plans needed writing. The letter was in English, but the handwriting suggested someone for whom English was a second language. It read, "Dear Mr. Carver, my name is Anna Hoffmann Weber. I do not know if you remember me. In March 1945, you were a sergeant in the American Army. You found me in Oberkirchen after the bombing. You and your crew saved my life. I have wanted to write to you for many years. It took a long time to find your address. I wanted you to know that I am alive. I am married. I have a daughter. She is 3 years old. Her name is Clara. I tell her stories about the war. I tell her about the American soldiers who dug through rubble for 2 hours to save a little girl they had never met. I tell her that people can choose kindness even during terrible things. I wanted you to know that I remember you. I will always remember you. Thank you for stopping. Thank you for listening. Thank you for deciding that one child's life mattered more than following your orders exactly. With gratitude, Anna." Carver read the letter 3 times. Then he showed it to his wife. Then he called the other members of his old crew. Foster was in Louisiana. Mitchell was in Ohio. Hayes was in California. Reese was in Kansas. He hadn't spoken to any of them in years. They'd stayed in touch for maybe 2 years after the war, then drifted apart as veterans do. Different lives. Different states. Different priorities. But they all remembered Oberkirchen. They all remembered the girl. When Carver told them about the letter, every one of them reacted the same way. Silence for a moment. Then quiet acknowledgement. She'd survived. She'd built a life. That mattered. Foster said something that stayed with Carver. He said, "Sometimes I wonder what we did during the war. Whether it meant anything. Whether we made anything better. Then I think about that girl. We made her life better. That's something." The letter was written on thin paper with a return address in Stuttgart. Carver wrote back. Brief note. Said he remembered her. Said he was glad she was well. Said she didn't need to thank him. Said he'd only done what was right. She wrote back again 6 months later. This time she included a photograph. A family portrait. Anna, her husband, their daughter. Taken in a park somewhere in West Germany. They looked happy. Normal. Like people who hadn't lived through the apocalypse. Like the war was something that had happened to other people. Carver kept that photograph on his desk for the rest of his life. His students sometimes asked about it. He told them the story. Simplified version. American tank crew finds German girl in rubble. Saves her. She grows up. Lives a good life. Some of his students understood the significance. Others didn't. That was fine. The story didn't need to be universally understood. It just needed to be true. Over the years, Carver corresponded with Anna perhaps a dozen times. Short letters. Updates about families and work and ordinary life. She stayed in Germany. Never emigrated to the United States like her aunt had hoped. Built a career as a social worker helping other refugees and displaced persons. Raised 2 children. Became a grandmother. Lived a full, complicated, meaningful life that wouldn't have existed if 5 American soldiers hadn't stopped their tank and decided to listen. In 1977, Carver traveled to Germany with his wife. Tourism trip. They visited Berlin and Munich and Dresden. Saw the new buildings constructed over the ruins of old ones. Saw the scars that still remained 32 years after the war ended. Saw a nation rebuilt. They met Anna in Stuttgart. She was 36 years old. Professional woman. Confident. Articulate. Nothing about her appearance suggested the terrified child buried in rubble. But when they talked, she said the war had shaped everything about how she saw the world. Said she couldn't enter enclosed spaces without experiencing panic. Said she couldn't hear rubble falling without freezing. Said she had nightmares about darkness and weight and calling for help that never came. Except help did come. That was her core understanding of human nature. In the middle of destruction and chaos and systematic violence, help came. 5 soldiers who didn't have to stop, stopped. They didn't know her. They gained nothing from saving her. They actually risked punishment. But they did it anyway because it was right. Carver asked her what she remembered about being rescued. She said she remembered hands reaching down into darkness. Remembered voices speaking a language she didn't understand but whose tone communicated safety. Remembered music, someone humming something soft and gentle. Remembered being lifted into sunlight. Remembered the face of the soldier who pulled her out of the rubble. She'd been too young to remember his name or his features clearly, but she remembered his expression. Determined. Focused. Like nothing in the world mattered more than getting one small girl out of a collapsed building. That memory sustained her through everything that came after. The refugee camps. The displacement. The gradual process of building a new life from nothing. When things were difficult, she thought about those hands reaching down. She thought about people who chose to help when they didn't have to. That evidence, proof that kindness existed even during the worst moments of human history, gave her something to hold on to. They talked for 3 hours in a Stuttgart cafe. Then Carver and his wife returned to their hotel. Before leaving, Anna gave him a gift. A book. Collection of interviews she'd conducted with refugees and displaced persons for her social work. Stories of survival and resilience and unexpected mercy. She dedicated the book to the American soldiers who stopped to listen. Carver died in 1996 at age 75. Heart attack. His memorial service was attended by family, former students, and one elderly German woman who flew from Stuttgart to Richmond to say goodbye. Anna spoke briefly at the service. Said Thomas Carver had taught her that humanity persists even when systems break down. Said he'd shown her that individuals can choose differently than their circumstances would suggest. Said she'd spent her entire adult life trying to pass on the lesson she learned in March 1945, sometimes stopping is more important than continuing. Sometimes listening is more important than following orders. Sometimes one life matters more than strategic objectives. The other crew members from Charlie 27 attended the funeral. Foster came from Louisiana. Mitchell came from Ohio. Hayes came from California. Reese came from Kansas. They were all in their 70s by then. Gray hair. Worn faces. Bodies marked by age and work and the accumulated weight of decades. But when they saw each other, they were 24 and 22 and 26 and 20 and 19 again. The crew of Charlie 27. The men who stopped. After the service, they stood together outside the funeral home. Didn't say much. Just stood there thinking about Oberkirchen and March 1945 and a little girl crying in rubble. Hayes said, "We made the right call that day." The others nodded. That was the only eulogy Carver needed. 3 words from his gunner. They'd made the right call. The town of Oberkirchen was rebuilt. It took 15 years. Some of the original street plans were preserved. Some weren't. New buildings rose where old buildings had stood. Modern architecture mixed with reconstructed historical facades. By 1960, you could walk through Oberkirchen and see almost no evidence that the town had been destroyed. Almost. In 1985, the town erected a memorial. Small stone marker in the central square. It listed the names of 247 civilians killed during the bombing on March 15, 1945. Anna Hoffmann's parents were on that list. Her 2 older brothers. Her grandparents. Most of her extended family. The memorial didn't mention the American tank crew that had returned 2 days later. That was a different story. Private. Personal. Not part of the official historical record. But Anna knew. She visited Oberkirchen every year on March 17. She stood where her childhood home had been. She thought about her family. She thought about darkness and hands and voices and the moment someone decided to stop. She brought her children there when they were old enough to understand. She brought her grandchildren later. She told them the complete story. Both parts. The destruction and the rescue. The loss and the recovery. The cruelty and the mercy. That was the legacy. Not the strategic importance of clearing a supply route through a destroyed town. Not the tactical achievements of the 3rd Armored Division in March 1945. Not the contribution of Charlie 27 to the Allied victory. Those things were recorded in official histories and military archives. The legacy was simpler. 5 men heard a child crying and stopped. That decision created a ripple that extended across decades and continents. Anna lived. She raised children who raised children. She helped thousands of refugees rebuild their lives. She taught social workers and counselors and aid workers about trauma and recovery and the fundamental importance of human connection. All of that happened because Thomas Carver said, "I don't care." He didn't care about orders. Didn't care about the supply convoy. Didn't care about the punishment he knew would come. He cared about a child he'd never met. That mattered more than everything else. The other crew members carried that lesson forward too. Foster became a pastor after the war. Worked with poor communities in Louisiana for 40 years. He said the most important sermon he ever preached was nonverbal. It happened in Germany in 1945 when his crew stopped to dig. Mitchell became a teacher. Taught mathematics in a public school in Cleveland. He told his students that the most important equation they'd ever learn was simple: 1 life equals infinite value. Hayes worked in construction in Los Angeles. He built homes for low-income families. He said he was trying to put things back together after spending years taking them apart. Reese farmed in Kansas. He said he liked growing things after a war spent destroying things. None of them spoke about Oberkirchen often. It wasn't the kind of story that played well at reunions or barbecues. It didn't fit the narrative of World War II that dominated American culture in the 1950s and 1960s. That narrative emphasized clear moral lines, good Americans versus evil Germans. Heroes and villains. Liberation and victory. But Oberkirchen was complicated. Americans had bombed the town and killed hundreds of civilians. Those same Americans had then saved one specific civilian from the rubble. Both things were true. The complexity couldn't be resolved by choosing one narrative over the other. You had to hold both truths simultaneously. Destruction and mercy. Violence and compassion. Orders and conscience. That was the real legacy of March 17, 1945. The recognition that war doesn't eliminate moral choice. It just makes moral choice harder. Soldiers can follow orders and also choose humanity. Systems can demand obedience and individuals can still decide which orders deserve to be followed and which deserve to be questioned. Charlie 27's crew questioned their orders for approximately 2 hours. That was all. 2 hours out of 7 months of combat. 2 hours out of a war that lasted 6 years and killed 60 million people. A tiny fraction of the total violence. Statistically insignificant. But to Anna Hoffmann Weber, those 2 hours were everything. They were the difference between death and life. Between ending at age 4 in the darkness and living to become a mother, a grandmother, a professional who helped others survive their own traumas. The last surviving member of Charlie 27's crew was Leon Foster. He died in 2009 at age 84. Before his death, he recorded an oral history interview for the Veterans History Project. The interviewer asked him about his most significant memory from World War II. Foster thought for a moment, then said, "We stopped to listen. That's what I remember most. We stopped our tank because we heard a child crying. My commander said we were going to help, and we did. I don't remember most of the missions we ran. Don't remember most of the places we went. But I remember Oberkirchen. I remember digging through rubble for 2 hours. I remember pulling that little girl out and knowing we'd done something that mattered. Everything else we did during the war, I'm not sure it mattered. But that did. That one thing definitely mattered." The interview is archived at the Library of Congress. You can listen to it online. Foster's voice is old and tired, but when he talks about the girl, something changes. He sounds younger. More certain. Like he's back in March 1945, standing beside a Sherman tank, holding a child who's just been pulled from darkness into light. That sound, that certainty, is what remains. Not the destroyed buildings or the strategic importance of supply routes or the tactical achievements of mechanized warfare. What remains is the memory of a moment when 5 men chose differently. They chose to stop. They chose to listen. They chose to dig. They chose one life over everything else. In doing so, they proved something important about human nature. Even after 7 months of training to ignore suffering and follow orders and complete missions regardless of cost, even after becoming extensions of their machine, even after learning not to care, they could still hear a child crying. And hearing that cry, they could still decide to answer it. That's the legacy. That's what the war couldn't destroy. The capacity to hear someone else's pain and respond to it. The willingness to stop moving forward and tend to what's been broken. The recognition that sometimes the most important thing you can do is pause and pay attention and extend your hand into darkness and pull someone toward safety. Anna Hoffmann Weber died in 2018 at age 77. She left behind 2 children, 5 grandchildren, and 3 great-grandchildren. Her family held a memorial service in Stuttgart. Among the items displayed was a photograph of 5 young American soldiers standing beside a Sherman tank, smiling, looking impossibly young and impossibly alive. The photograph was taken in Germany in April 1945, a few weeks after Oberkirchen. At the service, Anna's daughter read from her mother's journals. One entry, dated March 17, 2005, the 60th anniversary of her rescue, said, "I think often about what would have happened if Sergeant Carver had followed his orders. If he had continued through Oberkirchen without stopping. If he had decided that one child's life was less important than completing his mission on time. I would have died in that rubble. No one else was coming. The town was considered cleared. My fate was sealed. But he stopped. He and his crew decided that orders could be bent. That schedules could be delayed. That punishment was worth risking if it meant saving a life. That decision created everything I have. My husband. My children. My career. My home. All of it exists because 5 men decided to listen. I have spent my entire life trying to deserve their choice. Trying to help others the way they helped me. Trying to pass on the lesson they taught me in actions rather than words. In moments of crisis, choose humanity. Even when systems tell you to keep moving, stop. Even when following orders seems more important, listen. Even when efficiency matters more than individuals, remember that individual lives are what we're fighting for in the first place. I don't know if I've succeeded in deserving their choice. But I've tried. Every day since March 17, 1945, I've tried. The war ended 79 years ago. The soldiers who fought it are almost all gone now. The systems and strategies and tactical doctrines have been studied and revised and studied again. Historians have written thousands of books about World War II. They've analyzed every campaign and every battle and every decision made by generals and politicians. But sometimes history isn't about campaigns and battles. Sometimes it's about one tank stopping in one destroyed town and 5 men deciding to dig. Sometimes the most important strategic decision isn't made by a general at headquarters. It's made by a sergeant in a tank commander's cupola who hears crying and says, "I don't care about orders. Get down here and help me." That decision, that moment of choosing humanity over efficiency, echoes forward through time. It doesn't appear in most history books. It didn't change the outcome of the war. It didn't affect strategic decisions or tactical achievements. But it changed one life completely. And that one life created other lives. And those lives created still more lives. And somewhere in Germany today, children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren are living because 5 American soldiers stopped their tank on March 17, 1945 and decided that one crying child mattered more than following orders. The rubble of Oberkirchen is gone. The Sherman tanks are gone. The soldiers are gone. Anna is gone. But the choice remains. In every moment of crisis, in every situation where systems demand obedience and humanity demands something else, the choice remains. Stop or continue. Listen or ignore. Help or move on. The crew of Charlie 27 made their choice. That's what we inherit. Not just the memory of what they did, but the knowledge that such choices are always possible. Even in war. Even under orders. Even when stopping seems impossible. You can always stop. You can always listen. Sometimes that's enough to change everything.